"You're grounded, Afton. Cut off from those people." My mother's voice still shrieked in my mind, a ghost of the last time I'd stood in her shadow. "Apologize to Lizzie and forget those battle buddies. They're nothing but disposable trash." I had only smiled then, a cold, quiet fine that had preceded the arrival of 300 Navy SEALs who stood as one to expose the truth she was too blind to see. Watching her hands shake as she realized I was their commander was the only inheritance I truly valued. I shook the memory away, focusing on the road ahead as the salt air began to scrub the scent of her disdain from my skin. The palm trees of Coronado leaned away from the Pacific breeze, their long shadows stretching across the pristine pavement like dark fingers pointing toward a past I had tried to outrun. My Jeep Wrangler, caked in the red clay of a training range and the fine gray dust of a desert I couldn't name aloud, felt like a blemish on these perfect streets. I watched the reflection of the rugged vehicle in the glass storefronts of Orange Avenue, a stark contrast to the polished Teslas and pristine Porsches idling at the stoplights. I've spent 15 years learning that silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's a fortress. Inside that Jeep, there were no weapons, no tactical gear, only a small, hand-carved wooden box sitting on the passenger seat, and the heavy, invisible memories of men who didn't make it back to see a California sunset. People often think strength is measured by the volume of your voice or the weight of your bank account. They're wrong. True strength is the ability to hold your ground when the very earth beneath your feet tries to shift. My hand rested near the garment on my wrist, the tactile habit of a woman who has spent her life tracking time in seconds of survival. Looking at the Mediterranean-style estates lining the coast, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. I wasn't here for a victory lap or a confrontation. I was here to find a moment of quiet, a chance to honor a promise made in the dirt of a distant land. Dignity is a quiet empire, an inner sanctuary that no one can invade unless you are foolish enough to hand over the keys. As I pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of the Brennan estate, the familiar scent of salt air and jasmine hit me, but it felt cold. Sante stood there, framed by the bougainvillea, draped in silk and a strand of Mikimoto pearls that probably cost more than my first year's salary in the Navy. She didn't move toward the gate. She didn't wave. She simply stood there with a glass of Chardonnay held like a scepter, her eyes scanning my mud-streaked Jeep with a clinical, biting disdain. "Afton," she said, her voice carrying over the intercom with the sharp edge of a judge delivering a sentence. "You've arrived. I specifically asked you to be mindful of the neighbors. That machine you're driving is an eyesore. It's devaluing the curb appeal of the entire block before the guests even arrive." I didn't reach for the gate remote, nor did I remind her that this machine had carried me through terrain so treacherous it could have swallowed her silk slippers. I just looked at her through the windshield, her expression as incomprehensible as a topographical map in the dark. Some people are so preoccupied with outward glamour that they never notice the rotting foundation beneath. "The gate stays closed," Sante continued, her tone dismissive as she sipped her wine. "Park that rusty relic in the public lot 3 blocks down, and when you return, use the rear service entrance through the alley. I won't have you tracking military grime onto the Persian rugs in the foyer while Lizzie is hosting her colleagues. It's a matter of basic respect for the house. The rear entrance, the path for the caterers, the housekeepers, and the people the Brennans wanted to keep out of sight." A lesser woman might have screamed, might have cited her rank as a commander, or the medals tucked away in her bag, but I simply nodded. I chose to comply not out of a lack of spirit, but because my grandmother had loved this house, and I still held a flicker of hope that the walls remembered her kindness even if Sante had erased it. I parked the Jeep in the shadows of the public lot and began the walk back. My heavy boots thudded against the brick of the service path, a rhythmic, solitary sound that felt like a march. The duffel bag was heavy on my shoulder, but the weight was familiar, a comfort compared to the suffocating lightness of the Brennan dinner table. Have you ever been made to feel like a stranger in the very place that should have been your sanctuary? It's a unique kind of displacement, being erased by the people who share your blood. Near the back door, I encountered a young girl, likely no older than 19, struggling with a massive crate of crystal stemware. Her face was flushed with the effort, her hands trembling as the crate slipped. I moved instinctively, my boots silent on the stone as I reached out with one hand to steady the weight. The girl looked up, startled by the sudden presence of a woman in a dusty flight jacket with eyes that looked like they'd seen 1,000 years. "I've got you," I said softly, my voice steady. "Breathe. Just find your balance." I held the crate until she regained her grip, offering her a small smile that didn't quite reach my tired eyes. She whispered a frantic thank you, her gaze lingering on the scar along my jawline before she hurried inside. It was a fleeting moment, but it reminded me that kindness is the only currency that never loses its value, even in a house that tries to bankrupt your spirit. I took a final look at the North Island naval base across the water, the lights of the carriers flickering like stars grounded on the horizon. I reached for the handle of the service door, my fingers brushing the small wooden box in my jacket pocket. Sante and Lizzie were inside, already weaving their stories, already deciding who I was allowed to be in their world. They didn't understand that the shadows they forced me into were the very places where I learned how to see in the dark. The hallway transition from the kitchen to the rest of the mansion was like moving between two different centuries. The back corridor, narrow and utilitarian, smelled of industrial floor wax and the frantic heat of the catering staff. But as I stepped toward the family wing, the air grew thick with the cloying scent of lavender sachets and the heavy, savory aroma of a roasting turkey that had been basted in enough butter to drown a battalion. It was a sensory ambush, a reminder that in this house, appearances were the only currency that didn't devalue. I moved into the small, windowless room assigned to me. The servants' quarters Sante deemed appropriate for a daughter who had spent a decade in the dirt. It was barely wider than a hallway, containing a single iron cot and a dresser with a missing handle. I set my tactical duffel on the thin mattress, the weight of the hand-carved wooden box inside pressing against my palm. I began to unpack, my movements precise and economical, a habit born of living out of lockers and cramped ship berths. I had just reached for the wooden box, the anchor of hope, when the door swung open without a knock. The rustle of silk preceded her like a warning siren. Lizzie stood in the doorway, her designer dress the color of a fresh bruise, her eyes scanning the room with a look of clinical disgust. "Good, you're here," she said, her voice thin and polished. "Mother wants you at the table in 10 minutes. Try not to bring the smell of the motor pool with you." She didn't wait for a response. She stepped into the room, her gaze falling on my duffel bag. Before I could intercept, she reached out with manicured fingers and pulled the wooden box from the duffel. She held it as if it were a biohazard, her lip curling as she ran a finger over the rough, hand-carved grain. This box contained the letters, the worn photographs, and the posthumous medals of the man who died so I could keep breathing. To Lizzie, it was just an old piece of wood. "What is this junk, Afton?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "More military refuse? It smells like grease and sweat. We're trying to have a refined holiday, not a memorial for your little adrenaline junkie club." I stood perfectly still, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the edge of the iron cot. A profound, icy calm settled over me. The same calm I used when the horizon was lit with tracers. I thought of the truth that true honor isn't something you display on a mahogany mantle. It's something you carry in the quiet, broken parts of your soul when the rest of the world is asleep. Lizzie's cruelty didn't anger me as much as it saddened me. She was a woman who had never known the cost of a single day of her own freedom. "It's a personal item, Lizzie. Put it down," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a direct command. She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed off the bare walls. "It's trash, just like the people you spend your time with. You've always had a flair for the dramatic, but Mother is right. You need to let go of these dirty little trophies." With a flick of her wrist, she dropped the box. It hit the metal rim of the wastepaper basket with a hollow thud before sliding into the dark interior, landing amongst crumpled tissues and discarded candy wrappers. She wiped her hands on her dress as if she'd touched something contagious and walked out, her perfume lingering in the air like a stain. I didn't chase her. I didn't scream. I simply stood there, listening to the rhythmic thumping of my own heart. I slowly knelt beside the trash can. My fingers were steady as I retrieved the box, brushing away a smudge of ash from its surface. I pulled out the silver star, the gold reflecting the dim light of the overhead bulb. "I'm sorry, brother," I whispered to the empty room. "They don't know the weight of the gold they're throwing away." I tucked the medals into my inner jacket pocket, feeling the cold metal settle against my ribs. The transition to the grand dining hall was a study in theatrical artifice. The 20 relatives were already seated, a sea of cashmere and diamonds beneath a crystal chandelier that threw 1,000 tiny rainbows across the silver-laden table. Sante sat at the head, her posture as rigid as the sterling forks on either side of her plate. I took my seat at the very edge of the long table, the folding chair position usually reserved for the teenagers who hadn't quite earned their place in the adult world. The dinner conversation was a choreographed dance of ego and status. Lizzie spoke at length about her latest high-profile litigation, her words peppered with legal jargon meant to intimidate and impress. When a distant cousin, a kind-faced man from the Midwest, turned to me and asked about my recent deployment, the room went quiet. I opened my mouth to speak, but Sante's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Oh, don't bother Afton with questions about her work, Henry," Sante said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "She's essentially a failed government security clerk these days. It's mostly manual labor and endless bureaucracy. Her mind has become a bit dulled by it all. We find it's best to keep the conversation light so she doesn't feel overwhelmed." I felt the eyes of 20 people turn toward me, some with pity, others with a smug sense of superiority. It's a strange thing, being treated like a ghost at your own family table. I realized then that being forgotten by those who share your blood is actually the ultimate form of liberation. Their expectations no longer had a grip on my future because they had already decided I didn't have one. Lizzie reached for the bottle of Cabernet, leaning over to refill my glass. She did it with a practiced clumsiness, letting a few dark red drops splash onto the leather of my boots. She smirked, her eyes meeting mine for a split second, waiting for the instability they so desperately wanted to document. I didn't give it to her. I reached for a linen napkin and wiped the leather with a single, precise motion. Military-grade composure is a weapon they didn't know I possessed. A young cousin, a boy of about 10 sitting next to me, watched the interaction with wide, confused eyes. He could sense the rot beneath the silk. I leaned in toward him, my voice low and warm. "Don't let the noise of the world drown out the truth of who you are, kid. Kindness is the only currency that never devalues, no matter what people at the head of the table say." He nodded, a small spark of understanding in his gaze. I felt the weight of the garner watch on my wrist, the vibration of a silent alert that only I could feel. I wasn't just sitting there. I was observing the architecture of their impending collapse. I noted the frantic tension in Sante's jaw, the way her hand trembled as she held her glass. She was a woman drowning in a sea of debt, looking for a life raft to steal. The silver fork in my hand felt heavier than a combat knife as Sante stood up, signaling for the servers to clear the plates. The air in the room thickened, the scent of lavender replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of an impending ambush. Sante reached beneath her chair and pulled out a thick, manila envelope, her fingers clutching it with a desperation that bordered on the manic. "Before we move to dessert," Sante announced, her voice trembling with a forced, terrifying cheerfulness, "I have a special announcement regarding the family estate and Afton's future care. We've all been very concerned about her stability, and it's time we addressed it as a family." I looked at the wine stain on the white tablecloth and realized this wasn't just a dinner, it was a sentencing hearing, and they had no idea I was the one holding the evidence that could set the whole house on fire. The grand dining room felt like a pressurized cabin, the air thinning as Sante clutched that manila envelope. I stood up before the special announcement could be fully unleashed, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't offer an argument. I offered a tactical retreat. I told them I needed to secure my gear in the study, a small act of autonomy they were too eager to grant, thinking they had already won the psychological war. By midnight, the Brennan mansion had settled into a deceptive, expensive silence. The relatives had retired to the guest wings, their bellies full of turkey and their minds poisoned by Sante's whispers. I moved through the dark hallways with the silent precision I'd perfected during a decade of recon missions. My boots made no sound on the hardwood. I reached the kitchen where the remnants of the banquet lay scattered across the island. Cracked turkey bones, half-empty wine bottles, and the stained linen napkins Lizzie had used to mock my life. It was a graveyard of excess, a mirror of a family that consumed everything and valued nothing. I slipped into Sante's private study to retrieve my duffel bag. The room smelled of old leather and the metallic tang of Sante's desperation. My eyes immediately landed on her mahogany desk. There, left unsecured and glowing faintly under the moonlight, was a thick folder. It was a classic tactical error. Overconfidence. Sante assumed her broken daughter was too far gone to look. I opened the folder, my breath hitching for a fraction of a second before my training took over. It wasn't just a trust amendment. It was a legal petition for involuntary civil commitment and permanent guardianship of an incapacitated adult. Tucked behind the legal jargon was a fabricated medical report signed by a Dr. Sterling. It described Afton Brennan as a woman suffering from aggressive, unmanaged PTSD and severe cognitive impairment, rendering me a danger to myself and the family's assets. They weren't just after the Grandma Eleanor Trust. They were trying to erase my very existence as a functional human being. Betrayal is a cruel mirror. It doesn't just show you the enemy's face. It shows you the depth of the lies you were willing to believe about those you loved. I realized they wanted to trade my freedom for their financial survival. The icy resolve that had kept me alive in the mountains of the Hindu Kush now hardened into a shield around my heart. The door creaked behind me. I didn't jump. I didn't even turn around until the shadow of Sante crossed the desk. She stood in the doorway, her silk robe fluttering like the wings of a moth drawn to a flame. She saw the folder in my hands, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she draped herself in a cloak of cruel compassion, her voice a soft, terrifying melody of manipulation. "Afton, sweetheart, you weren't supposed to see that yet," she whispered, stepping into the room. "We're doing this for you. Your father and I. We see how much you're struggling. You belong in a quiet facility, a place where professionals can manage the damage the military did to you. It's the only way to preserve the family name from a public breakdown." Lizzie appeared behind her, her arms crossed, her eyes cold as San Diego marble. "Your compass is broken, Afton. You've spent too much time in the dirt. You aren't fit to handle the estate Grandma Eleanor left you. We're just being responsible." I looked at my mother, the woman who had once tucked me into bed, and felt a profound, bone-deep sadness. "Mother, you think love is a leash, but true love is a light," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremors they so badly wanted to see. "You aren't trying to save me. You're trying to hide your own catastrophic debts behind my forced silence. I still choose to forgive you for your fear, but I will no longer permit you to use it as a weapon against my life." I mentally logged the legal landscape. Under California law and the Americans with Disabilities Act, a fraudulent medical diagnosis used to seize assets is a felony. Their shadow docket lacked any semblance of due process. They were counting on my shame to keep me quiet, unaware that a soldier's greatest strength is her ability to stand in the light of the truth. I didn't rip the papers. I didn't scream. I pulled my Garner tactical device from my pocket and took high-resolution photos of every page, the metadata and timestamps burning into the digital record. I placed the folder back exactly as I had found it, my movements a masterclass in professional detachment. The best revenge is to remain entirely unlike the person who performed the injury. I walked out of the study, passing the servants' quarters on my way back to the iron cot I'd been assigned. In the dim light of the hall, I saw the young catering girl from earlier. She was sitting on a crate, her head in her hands, looking like the weight of the Brennans' expectations was crushing her too. I stopped and reached into my kit, handing her a high-protein bar. "Rest when you can," I whispered, meeting her startled eyes. "You're doing a great job, and you're worth far more than the pittance they're paying you tonight. Don't let this house convince you otherwise." She took the bar, a small flicker of hope crossing her face. I kept moving. The insanity petition was set to be filed Monday morning. That gave me exactly 48 hours to mobilize the only family that had ever truly had my back. I closed the door to my room and felt the low-frequency hum of a world they couldn't see. I had been grounded by a mother who had just signed her own social death warrant, unaware that my battle buddies were already tracking the signal I'd sent into the night. The dining hall light felt like a heavy weight, the massive crystal chandelier casting sharp, jagged shadows across the bone china plates. I walked back into the room, my posture rigid, every muscle in my body tuned to the low-frequency vibration of a world my family couldn't see. The 20 relatives had finished their main course, but the hunger in the room had shifted from food to the impending social execution Sante was about to perform. I took my seat at the edge of the long oak table, a ghost in a room full of people who shared my blood, but not my spirit. Sante stood at the head of the table, her shadow stretching long and thin across the white linen like a dark stain. She held the wine glass with a white-knuckled grip, her face a mask of practiced tragic concern. The room fell into a suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a landslide. Looking at her, I didn't see a mother. I saw a woman so terrified of her own financial ruin that she was willing to bury her youngest daughter alive in a facility just to keep the lights on in this mansion. Afton Brennan has always been a challenge, Sante began, her voice carrying the practiced resonance of a judge delivering a final verdict. She spoke of my violent and low-class military career as if it were a criminal record, accusing me of bringing unstable energy into a house of refinement. She painted a picture of a woman broken by war, a liability that the family could no longer ignore. Have you ever stood in a room where people talked about you as if you were already a memory? It's a unique kind of violence, being redefined by people who never bothered to know you. Sante pointed a trembling, manicured finger toward Lizzie. Lizzie has been nothing but patient, yet Afton continues to disrespect the very people who protect her. Afton, stand up. You will apologize to your sister right now for the filth you brought into this home and for the scene you've caused. Lizzie sat back, her silk dress rustling as she adopted a look of wounded dignity. She smirked, a small, ugly expression that only I could see from my three-quarters angle. I didn't move. I sat motionless, reflecting on the ancient wisdom that a lion does not turn around when a small dog barks. Their insults didn't define my worth. They only defined their own staggering fear of my strength. I had faced down warlords in the Hindu Kush. A sister's jealousy was just static in the background. Afton, I am speaking to you. Sante's voice broke into a shriek, her composure finally fracturing. Since you refuse to act like an adult, you will be treated like the child you clearly are. You are grounded. As of this moment, you are cut off from those people, those battle buddies you call family. They are nothing but disposable trash, and they will not be allowed to poison this house any longer. Sante signaled to the 2 private security guards she'd hired, men with thick necks and empty eyes who stood by the mahogany doors. They moved in, their shadows falling over my plate as they blocked my exit. Sante declared that for my own safety, my phone, my tactical watch, and my freedom were being confiscated until the legal hearing on Monday. This was more than a family argument. It was a brazen violation of the Fourth Amendment, a case of false imprisonment being staged under a chandelier. Despite the guards gripping my arms, I looked at the youngest one, a boy barely 20 with sweat beading on his upper lip. I could feel his hand shaking through my sleeve. "You're just doing your job, son," I said quietly, my voice steady enough to make Sante flinch. "Don't let this moment weigh on your conscience later. I'm not the one you should be afraid of." I logged the legal reality of the assault, the metadata of the moment burning into my memory for the courtroom battle to come. Sante reached for the Garmin watch on my wrist, her face twisted with a frantic, desperate greed. I didn't resist. I let her grab it, but as her fingers fumbled with the strap, I subtly tapped the side button sequence, the tactical, distress and location signal I'd programmed years ago for situations exactly like this. The watch went dark in her hand, its mission already accomplished. I looked my mother dead in the eye, and for the first time in 35 years, I let the mask of the obedient daughter slip away entirely. A thin, chillingly calm smile spread across my face. A professional's smile. The kind you wear when you've just finalized the battlefield map and realized the enemy has walked right into the kill zone. Sante froze, her wine glass rattling against her teeth as she stared at me. I said one word, a quiet Tuyen Gong of my own power. "Fine." The most dangerous person in the world is the one who has nothing left to lose but her honor. By grounding me, Sante had inadvertently locked herself in a room with the very storm she spent her life trying to avoid. She thought she was taking my freedom, but she was actually just handing me the tactical advantage of a closed environment. I didn't need to shout. The silence of my smile told the relatives everything they needed to know about who was really in control. I was led away toward the servants' quarters, the relatives whispering and laughing behind me, their voices sounding thin and trivial against the rising roar in my ears. I paused by the window of my small room, looking out over the Pacific. The sea mist was finally clearing, and the dark horizon was filled with the rhythmic, synchronized blinking of red lights from the approaching Seahawk helicopters. I heard the click of the lock on the outside of my door and let out a long, slow breath. They thought they had trapped a daughter, but they had actually just given my unit a target. The low-frequency hum of the Seahawk helicopters grew from a distant vibration in my marrow to a rhythmic, bone-shaking roar that rattled the single-pane window of the servants' quarters. I sat on the edge of the iron cot, my hands folded in my lap, illuminated only by the rhythmic crimson pulse of the Garner watch Sante had tried to confiscate. Beyond the locked door, the muffled acoustics of the mansion carried Sante's voice through the air vents, weaving a final, desperate tapestry of lies for the relatives. She was painting a picture of my complete psychological collapse, a narrative meant to justify the iron bars she intended to place around my life. Truth is like the tide. You can build sandcastles of lies all day, but the ocean doesn't need your permission to reclaim the shore. I felt no burning hatred for Sante in that moment, only a profound, weary compassion. She was a woman who valued the shine of porcelain and the prestige of a zip code more than the breathing, bleeding reality of her own flesh and blood. I stood up, my posture 3/4 toward the moonlit window, adjusting the collar of my flight jacket. I wasn't the broken daughter they were discussing downstairs. I was a commander of the United States Navy, and my unit was about to breach the silence of this house. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't just the noise. It was the synchronized arrival of 300 elite men moving as a single shadow across the Brennan lawn. The low-frequency thrum of the twin-engine birds hovering above the Pacific was joined by the heavy, disciplined cadence of combat boots on the gravel driveway. Looking back, I should have seen the poetic justice in the timing. My mother had spent the night trying to ground me, unaware that she had actually just designated herself as a target for the most efficient recovery team on the planet. The grand mahogany front doors didn't just open. They were bypassed with a precision that left the Brennan relatives frozen in mid-sip. 300 Navy SEALs in dress-white uniforms flooded the foyer and the coastal gardens simultaneously. They were bright as ghosts under the tactical floodlights, an army of white and gold that occupied the space with a terrifying, absolute silence. They didn't need to shout. Their presence was a declaration of war against the petty tyrannies of the dinner table. The sea mist swirled into the grand hall, mingling with the scent of Sante's expensive candles and the lingering aroma of the Thanksgiving feast. The SEALs formed two perfect, unyielding lines, creating a corridor of military honor that stretched from the servants' wing to the center of the mansion. Their medals caught the light of the crystal chandelier, outshining the diamonds around Lizzie's neck and the silver on the table. It was a cinematic collision of two worlds, the hollow prestige of Coronado society versus the hard-earned honor of the men who stood in the gap. Sante dropped her wine glass, the crystal shattering on the hardwood as her hands finally began to shake. She shrieked about trespassers and thugs, her voice cracking like dry wood. Lizzie retreated behind a marble pillar, her Instagram-perfect world evaporating into a sea of white uniforms and cold, tactical stares. They had spent decades making me feel small, but in the presence of these men, it was the Brennans who looked like children playing dress-up in a house that didn't belong to them. Gideon, standing 6'4" with a chest full of combat ribbons and the quiet intensity of a mountain, reached the servant's door. He didn't wait for Sante to produce a key. He simply looked at the young private security guard, the one I had offered a protein bar and a kind word to earlier. The boy's face was ashen, his fingers fumbling with the lock as he realized he had been holding a lion in a cage. He swung the door open and stepped back, his head bowed in a silent, instinctive apology. I stepped out of the darkness and into the corridor of white ghosts. I didn't look at Sante or Lizzie. My gaze stayed fixed on Gideon. As I reached the center of the hall, he snapped to the sharpest salute the relatives had ever seen. Behind him, 300 men followed suit in a single, thunderous motion. The sound of their heels hitting the floor was a declaration of identity. They weren't just my battle buddies. They were the family I had chosen when my own blood decided I was a liability. Sante tried to intervene, her voice high and panicked as she grabbed at Gideon's sleeve. "You don't understand. She's sick. Afton is unstable. She needs professional help." I stopped and turned to my mother, looking at her with a clarity that seemed to strip the silk from her bones. "You called them trash, Mother," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "But in the dark, these are the men who make sure you can sleep in the light. You spent the night trying to ground me, but you forgot one thing. I am the one who gives the orders now. I'm not sick. I'm just finally home. Honor isn't something given by a mother's approval. It's earned in the places where no one sees the sacrifice." Sante had demanded an apology for Lizzie, but the world was waiting to give me a salute. I felt the weight of 30 years of silence lifting off my shoulders, replaced by the solid, unwavering loyalty of the men standing in my hall. The grounded daughter was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, and exactly what it was going to cost Sante to keep this house. Sante's jaw hung slack as she looked at the rows of white ghosts, her eyes darting from Gideon to the relatives who were now staring at her with newfound horror. But the real shock, the one that would truly end her reign, came from the shadows behind the seals. A man in a sharp black suit stepped forward, clutching a leather briefcase that felt heavier than any weapon in the room. It was Caldwell, and the look in his eyes told me that the legal daggers were already unsheathed. Gideon didn't just stand there. He stepped aside as Caldwell approached, the lawyer's eyes cold and sharp as the legal daggers he was about to drive into the heart of the Brennan estate. My mother looked at the briefcase and then at me, her hands trembling so violently that she had to clutch the back of a dining chair to remain upright. The air in the mansion had changed. The lavender was gone, replaced by the unmistakable, cleansing scent of a storm that was no longer approaching, but had finally arrived. The atmospheric pressure inside the grand hall had reached a breaking point, the silence so heavy it felt as though the very walls of the mansion were bowing inward. I stood at the epicenter of a sea of dress-white uniforms, 300 of my brothers forming a living fortress of discipline and steel beneath the crystal chandelier. The scent of salt air and ozone had completely replaced the cloying lavender of Sante's artifice. It was the smell of the open sea, the smell of reality, and it was devastatingly clear. Gideon stepped forward, his boots clicking with a hollow, rhythmic authority against the hardwood. He moved into the pool of light directly in front of me, his posture an unyielding line of professional respect. In his hands, he carried a velvet-lined case that seemed to draw all the light in the room toward the gold within. My breath was steady, my heart beating with the slow, deliberate pace of a soldier who has already won the battle and is now merely accepting the surrender. He snapped to attention and began to read the formal citation, his voice echoing with the resonance of the United States Navy. He spoke of missions in shadows, of sacrifices made while the Brennans were choosing wallpaper, and of an extraordinary bravery that Sante had dared to call trash. He presented the Medal of Honor not as a trophy, but as a physical manifestation of a truth that could no longer be suppressed. Honor isn't a garment you inherit from ancestors, or a title you buy with a zip code. It's a soul fabric you weave yourself, thread by painful thread, in the dark places where no one is watching. As Gideon finished, he delivered a salute so sharp it seemed to cut the air. In a single, earth-shaking motion, 300 men followed him. The sound of their white-gloved hands hitting their brows was a thunderclap that sent the 20 relatives shrinking into their silk-covered chairs. The people who had spent the evening laughing at the failed clerk at the kids' table were now looking up at a national hero they weren't worthy to serve. It was a moment of profound, crushing vindication that required no shouting. Caldwell moved through the ranks of the SEALs like a ghost of the law, his leather briefcase clicking open as he reached the dining table. He didn't look at the relatives. He looked directly at Sante, his eyes as cold as a winter tide. He began pulling out notched property deeds and bank records with a surgical precision that made Lizzie's legal theatrics look like a child's puppet show. The ledger of truth was finally being opened, and the numbers didn't lie. He revealed the staggering reality of the Brennan finances. Sante's kingdom was an empty shell, a facade of wealth maintained by catastrophic secret investments and spiraling debt. The mansion we stood in hadn't belonged to Sante for years. It had been purchased anonymously by an LLC I had established to prevent its foreclosure after our grandmother died. Sante and Lizzie weren't supporting me. They were squatters in my house, living on my charity while they drafted a fraudulent petition to commit me to an asylum. Lizzie's composure didn't just break, it evaporated. Realizing her career would be annihilated if the fraudulent insanity file became public record, she lunged for the mahogany desk, her manicured fingers clawing for the petition. I didn't move to stop her. I simply touched the side of my Garner watch. I had been recording every second of Sante's threats and the security guard's assault. Under California's penal code, there is no expectation of privacy during the commission of a felony. I had the receipts for their entire conspiracy. Caldwell handed Sante a formal notice to quit, his voice devoid of any warmth. He reminded her that under federal law, conspiracy to commit fraud and civil rights violations carried mandatory minimums that no amount of social standing could erase. Sante looked at the document and then at the 300 men in white, her hands trembling so violently that the papers fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. Her reign wasn't just ending, it was being erased by the very daughter she thought she could bury. Sante fell to her knees, her silk robe dragging in the spilled wine on the floor. She attempted to play the loving mother card one last time, her voice a ragged sob as she begged me to think of the family. I looked down at her, not with the fire of hatred, but with a weary, professional distance that was far more lethal. You cannot heal a house if you keep the rot in the walls, and the rot had reached the foundation long ago. I'm not doing this to hurt you, Mother, I said softly, the words hanging in the air like a final judgment. I'm doing this because I'm a protector, and that includes protecting this house from what you've turned it into. You told me I was grounded, but you were the one trapped in a prison of your own pride. I forgive you for your fear, but I am no longer your prisoner. This house is mine, but the truth is yours to live with. I turned toward the 20 relatives and told them the party was over, my voice a quiet command that brooked no debate. I saw the young catering girl from earlier standing by the kitchen door, her eyes wide with awe. I walked over to the centerpiece, picked up the stack of $100 bills Sante had used as a vulgar display of wealth, and handed them to the girl. Take the night off, I told her. Go home with your head held high. You're the only one in this room who earned their keep tonight. Looking at the trident on the medals Gideon held, I understood that the Brennan name was just a shadow, but the honor of the service was a light. You cannot control what others do to you, but you can control who you become in the aftermath. Sante watched as her world turned to ash, her eyes fixed on the empty wine glass. I walked past her, my boots steady, and reached into the trash can by the servant's entrance to retrieve the one thing in this house that was truly sacred. The fog of Thanksgiving night finally surrendered to a cold, crystalline Californian dawn. I stood on the front porch of the Brennan mansion, my arms crossed against the salt-tinged air, watching the final act of a long-overdue eviction. Caldwell's legal team stood like sentinels near the wrought iron gates, their presence a silent barrier between the past and the future. Sante and Lizzie were loading the last of their designer suitcases into a waiting black sedan, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. The architecture of their arrogance had collapsed, leaving only the hollow remains of a family that lived for the shadows. Sante paused by the car door, her eyes rimmed with red, looking toward me with one last attempt at a tearful manipulation. She pleaded for the Brennan legacy, claiming that the coming scandal would destroy us all. I didn't respond with the anger she expected. I walked down the steps and handed her a simple white card for a reputable therapist and a document outlining a modest monthly allowance. It was tied to a mandatory accountability program. I am a daughter of mercy, not a daughter of revenge. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing the poison back into your veins. It means deciding that the debt is no longer worth carrying. Lizzie tried to hiss a final threat about a lawsuit, but Caldwell moved forward before she could finish. He presented her with the Bar Association's preliminary investigation notice regarding her fraudulent petition. Her face turned a sickly shade of gray. I looked at my sister, the woman who had tried to bury me in a cage of her own making. "The law is a shield for the weak, Lizzie, not a sword for the greedy," I said quietly. "You lost your edge because you lost your heart. This house isn't your battlefield anymore." I watched the car pull away, shrinking into the distance of the Coronado palm trees. I let out a heavy sigh, the kind that only comes when you finally set down a burden you were never meant to carry. The Brennan mansion felt lighter, as if the very air had been scrubbed clean. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the profound, aching silence of a person who had finally regained her name. I walked toward my Jeep, pausing to sit on the tailgate. I pulled the wooden box, the anchor of hope, from my pocket. In the soft light of the morning sun, I retrieved the metals Sante had discarded. I polished the dust of her disdain from the gold with a linen cloth, my hands steady and sure. I replaced each one in the box with a reverence that this house had never understood. Gideon and the remaining seals formed a silent guard of honor around me. We didn't need to speak. The shared look between us was a vow. My battle buddies had stood in the mist to remind me that I was never alone. As I prepared to leave, I noticed the young guard from the previous night standing by the gate. His face was pale, his eyes full of a dawning realization. I walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "There is always a choice to be better than the orders you're given," I told him, my voice firm but kind. "Remember that, son. Your character is the only thing they can't take from you." It was my last act in that house, a seed of mentorship in a place that had only ever grown weeds. Family is not just about blood ties. It's also about the people who will stand by you when things get tough. I looked at the 300 men in white, their presence a testament to a loyalty Sante could never buy. They weren't just standing up to expose my identity. They were standing up to help me find myself again. I turned the key in my Jeep, the powerful engine roaring wonderfully in the carefully orchestrated silence of the Coronado. 6 months have passed since that dawn. I am sitting on the porch of my small beach cottage now, far from the mahogany halls of the Brennan mansion. I'm kneeling in the warm sand, planting seagrass, a slow, patient process of rebuilding roots that can withstand the salt and the wind. I've used the resources from Grandma Eleanor's trust to start a foundation for veterans' families. I am transforming the trauma they tried to use against me into a bridge for others to cross. A letter arrived this morning from Sante. It was a simple handwritten note, the ink slightly blurred. It said, "I am starting to understand the difference between a house and a home. I'm sorry." I didn't cry. I didn't feel the old sting of betrayal. I simply smiled and placed the letter in a drawer. I've learned that while some actions are irrevocable, the human heart can still find its way back to the light if it's willing to walk through the truth.